Imagine controlling every dollar that flows between America and China. Every transaction, every trade deal, every financial instrument. Now imagine taking a 10% cut of all of it. That's exactly what one city accomplished for over 600 years, becoming so wealthy that a single merchant family could buy and sell entire kingdoms. So powerful that they literally owned the Mediterranean Sea. So innovative that they invented half the financial tools that still run Wall Street today. This wasn't London. This wasn't New York. This was a collection of muddy islands in a swamp that most people couldn't even find on a map. But what nobody knows is how Venice pulled off the greatest economic heist in human history. How they turned geographic disadvantage into unstoppable advantage. How they created the world's first global financial network from absolutely nothing. The secret wasn't military conquest or natural resources. It was something far more brilliant and ruthless. They invented modern capitalism itself, then used it to control the entire medieval world. Venice didn't just participate in international trade, they owned it. They didn't just use money, they controlled who could create it, move it, and profit from it. They built the first multinational corporations, the first stock markets, the first investment banks, and the first global currency system. When Marco Polo returned from China with silk and spices, he wasn't just bringing back exotic goods. He was bringing back intelligence that Venice would use to corner every market from London to Beijing. When Venetian ships dominated the seas, they weren't just transporting cargo. They were running the medieval equivalent of Amazon, Google, and Goldman Sachs combined. At their peak, Venice was generating more wealth than the Holy Roman Empire. A single Venetian trading voyage could earn more profit than most countries collected in taxes. Their bankers were lending money to kings and emperors across 3 continents. But the real story isn't just about wealth. It's about how a handful of merchant families figured out that controlling information and financial flows was infinitely more powerful than controlling territory or armies. They created a system so sophisticated that it would take the rest of the world 400 years to catch up. This is the story of how Venice became the medieval world's financial puppet master, and why their innovations still control how money moves around the world today. Welcome to the rise and fall of history's first financial empire. Today, when we think about global financial centers, we picture gleaming skyscrapers in Manhattan, trading floors in London, or tech campuses in Silicon Valley. We imagine sophisticated computer networks, complex derivatives, and trillion-dollar algorithms moving money at the speed of light. But over 1,000 years ago, the most advanced financial system on Earth was running out of a collection of marshy islands in northern Italy, where merchants in wooden boats were revolutionizing how money, information, and power flowed across continents. Venice in the medieval period wasn't just successful, it was impossibly, almost supernaturally successful. For over 6 centuries, this single city-state controlled more international trade than entire empires. They generated more wealth per capita than any society before or since. They created financial innovations that modern bankers still use today. The numbers are staggering. At its peak in the 14th century, Venice was home to 180,000 people, but controlled roughly 50% of all trade between Europe and Asia. A typical Venetian merchant earned more in a single year than a European peasant would see in 20 lifetimes. The city's government collected more tax revenue than the Kingdom of France, despite having a population smaller than modern-day Salt Lake City. But what made Venice truly unprecedented wasn't just the scale of their wealth, it was how they accumulated it. This wasn't a society built on conquest, natural resources, or agricultural surplus. Venice was built on pure financial engineering. They figured out how to make money from money itself, how to profit from other people's trade, and how to turn information into unstoppable economic advantage. The story begins in one of the most unlikely places imaginable, a mosquito-infested swamp where refugees were hiding from barbarian invasions. These weren't sophisticated financiers or experienced merchants. They were farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople who had fled to the only place their enemies couldn't follow them. Islands in the middle of a lagoon that flooded twice daily. What happened next challenges everything we think we know about how economic power develops. Instead of expanding outward through military conquest like every other medieval power, Venice expanded inward through financial innovation. Instead of trying to control territory, they focused on controlling trade routes. Instead of building armies, they built trading networks. The genius of Venice lay in recognizing something that no other medieval society understood. In an interconnected world, controlling the flows of commerce was more valuable than controlling the sources of production. You didn't need to own the silk farms in China or the spice plantations in India. You just needed to control how silk and spices moved from east to west. Venice became the medieval world's middleman, but they weren't passive intermediaries. They were active architects of a global economic system designed to channel wealth through their city. They created the first international banks, the first standardized currencies, the first commodity exchanges, and the first multinational corporations. More importantly, they figured out how to monetize information in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the internet age. Venetian merchants didn't just buy and sell goods. They bought and sold knowledge about market conditions, political developments, and trading opportunities across 3 continents. The system they built was so sophisticated that it survived the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, the discovery of America, and the opening of direct sea routes to Asia. For over 600 years, no matter how much the world changed around them, Venice remained at the center of global finance. But Venice's success story is also a cautionary tale about the limits of financial power. The same innovations that made them wealthy also made them vulnerable. The same networks that connected them to global markets also exposed them to global competition. The same financial engineering that generated unprecedented profits also created unprecedented risks. By the 16th century, Venice was facing challenges that their medieval business model couldn't solve. New trade routes had broken their geographic monopoly. New financial centers were competing with their innovations. New technologies were making their traditional advantages obsolete. The decline of Venice reveals something profound about the nature of economic power in a connected world. Financial dominance, no matter how sophisticated, is ultimately temporary. The innovations that create competitive advantage eventually spread to competitors. The networks that generate wealth eventually route around monopolistic control. But Venice's legacy isn't just about their rise and fall. It's about the financial tools and business models they created that still shape how the global economy works today. Modern banking, international trade finance, currency exchange, commodity markets, and even corporate governance all trace their origins back to innovations that Venetian merchants developed in medieval workshops and counting houses. When you use a credit card, you're using a system descended from Venetian letters of credit. When companies issue stock, they're using structures based on Venetian trading companies. When central banks manage currency exchange rates, they're applying principles that Venetian financiers perfected 700 years ago. The story of Venice is ultimately the story of how financial innovation can create extraordinary wealth and power, but also how that same innovation inevitably spreads beyond its creators. It's a story about the rise of capitalism, the birth of globalization, and the eternal tension between innovation and regulation, between profit and stability, between local control and global integration. Understanding how Venice became the medieval world's financial capital isn't just historical curiosity. It's essential for understanding how financial power works in any era. The same forces that made Venice wealthy are still shaping global markets today. The same innovations that gave Venice competitive advantage are still creating fortunes in Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and financial centers around the world. Venice proved that in a connected world, the most valuable asset isn't land or resources or even military power. It's the ability to innovate faster than your competitors, to process information more effectively than your rivals, and to build networks that others depend on but cannot replicate. Let me take you back to the year 697 CE, to a collection of muddy islands where a small group of refugees was about to accidentally invent modern capitalism. Chapter 1. Swamp Empire 697 CE. In a mosquito-infested lagoon off the coast of northern Italy, a group of refugees was making a decision that would reshape the global economy for the next 1,000 years. These weren't ambitious entrepreneurs or sophisticated financiers. They were scared, desperate people who had fled inland cities to escape the latest barbarian invasion. Lombard warriors had swept through northern Italy, burning cities and enslaving populations. The only safe place left was a collection of marshy islands that no army could reach and no one else wanted. The refugees called themselves Venetians, after the Roman province of Venetia that no longer existed. They were about to build something unprecedented, the world's first financial empire. The genius of what happened next wasn't immediately obvious. In fact, it looked like the opposite of genius. While every other medieval society was trying to control land and build walls, the Venetians were embracing their geographic limitations and turning them into competitive advantages. The lagoon that isolated them from land-based threats also connected them to sea-based opportunities. The tides that made their islands uncomfortable for habitation also made them perfect for shipbuilding and navigation. The marshes that couldn't support traditional agriculture forced them to specialize in trade and manufacturing. But the real breakthrough came from their political innovation. Instead of choosing a traditional king or adopting feudalism like the rest of medieval Europe, the Venetians created something unprecedented, a merchant republic designed specifically to maximize trade and profit. In 697, they elected their first doge, not a monarch with absolute power, but a chief executive whose authority was limited by a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent any individual from accumulating too much control over Venice's growing commercial operations. The political structure was revolutionary because it was designed by merchants for merchants. Every major decision was evaluated based on its impact on trade relationships and profit margins. Venice became the world's first society where commercial considerations outweighed military, religious, or aristocratic concerns. The early Venetians understood something that wouldn't become conventional wisdom for another 500 years. In an interconnected world, commercial networks were more valuable than military territories. You could make more money facilitating other people's trade than by trying to conquer and control the sources of that trade. This insight led to Venice's first major strategic decision. Instead of trying to expand inland and compete with land-based powers, they would expand outward across the sea and become the essential middleman between East and West. The timing was perfect. The fall of the Western Roman Empire had disrupted traditional trade routes, but demand for Eastern goods, silk, spices, precious metals, and luxury items remained strong in European markets. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople controlled the eastern end of these trade routes, but lacked the naval capacity to efficiently transport goods westward. Venice positioned itself as the crucial link in this transcontinental supply chain. Venetian merchants would travel to Constantinople and other eastern markets to purchase goods, then transport them to Western European cities where they could be sold at substantial markups. But the Venetians didn't just participate in existing trade networks, they systematically improved them. They developed new ship designs that could carry more cargo more efficiently. They established permanent trading posts in key cities. They created standardized weights, measures, and currency systems that reduced transaction costs and eliminated the chaos that characterized most medieval commerce. Most importantly, they began treating information as a tradable commodity. Venetian merchants didn't just buy and sell goods. They bought and sold knowledge about market conditions, political developments, and trading opportunities across the Mediterranean. This information network became Venice's most valuable asset. A Venetian merchant arriving in Constantinople would know more about market conditions in London than local merchants knew about conditions in nearby cities. This information advantage allowed Venetians to identify arbitrage opportunities, avoid political risks, and optimize their trading strategies in ways that gave them decisive competitive advantages. By 800 CE, Venice had established itself as the dominant maritime power in the Adriatic Sea. Their fleet was larger than most national navies. Their merchants were operating in dozens of cities across 3 continents. Their accumulated wealth was beginning to exceed that of traditional land-based kingdoms. But wealth brought new challenges. As Venice became more successful, they attracted more attention from potential competitors and enemies. Land-based powers began to see Venetian prosperity as a threat to their own interests. Rival maritime cities started copying Venetian innovations and competing for the same trade routes. Venice's response revealed the strategic thinking that would define their approach for the next 6 centuries. Instead of trying to maintain their advantages through military force or secrecy, they accelerated their innovation and expanded their networks faster than competitors could copy them. They began developing new financial instruments that allowed them to finance larger trading ventures with less capital. They created partnership structures that enabled multiple investors to share both risks and returns from trading expeditions. They established formal relationships with Eastern rulers that gave Venetian merchants preferential access to key markets. Most importantly, they started systematically documenting and codifying their business practices. Instead of relying on informal handshake agreements and personal relationships, Venetians developed written contracts, standardized accounting procedures, and formal legal frameworks for resolving commercial disputes. This documentation served multiple purposes. It reduced transaction costs by eliminating ambiguity about trading agreements. It enabled more complex business relationships by providing legal recourse when partnerships failed, and it allowed Venice to scale their operations by training new merchants in proven business methods. By 900 CE, Venice had created something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a standardized, scalable, and legally protected commercial system that could operate efficiently across vast distances and cultural differences. The system was generating extraordinary returns. A typical Venetian trading voyage could generate profits of 100 to 300%, compared to agricultural returns of maybe 5 to 10% in land-based economies. Venetian merchants were accumulating wealth faster than any previous commercial class in human history. But the Venetians understood that sustainable competitive advantage required more than just high returns. It required creating barriers to entry that would prevent competitors from replicating their success. Their solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to keep their innovations secret, they would use their accumulated wealth to build infrastructure that competitors couldn't replicate quickly or cheaply. Venice began investing their trading profits in shipbuilding facilities, port infrastructure, and warehouse complexes that gave them permanent operational advantages. They developed specialized manufacturing capabilities for producing goods that Eastern markets demanded. They established financial reserves that allowed them to weather temporary setbacks that might bankrupt smaller competitors. Most importantly, they started building what we would now recognize as the first multinational corporation. Instead of operating as individual merchants or small partnerships, Venice began coordinating their commercial activities through large, professionally managed trading companies that could pursue long-term strategies across multiple markets simultaneously. These companies represented a fundamental innovation in business organization. They combined the capital resources of multiple investors, the expertise of professional managers, and the legal protections of formal incorporation into entities that were more powerful and resilient than any previous form of commercial organization. By 1000 CE, Venetian trading companies were operating permanent offices in dozens of cities, maintaining fleets of hundreds of ships, and coordinating commercial activities across the entire Mediterranean region and beyond. The transformation was remarkable. In just 300 years, Venice had evolved from a collection of refugee settlements into the most sophisticated commercial organization in the world. They had created new forms of business organization, new financial instruments, new legal frameworks, and new operational methods that gave them decisive advantages over every potential competitor. But Venice's early success was just the foundation for what was coming next. Their real breakthrough would come when they figured out how to monetize their relationship with the Byzantine Empire and transform themselves from successful merchants into the indispensable financial intermediaries for all trade between East and West. The stage was set for Venice to become not just a successful trading city, but the beating heart of the medieval global economy. Chapter 2, Eastern Gateway, 1082 CE. In the Golden Halls of Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I was signing a document that would change the course of global economic history. He was granting Venice unprecedented trading privileges throughout the Byzantine Empire, complete exemption from all customs duties, the right to establish permanent trading colonies in every major Byzantine port, and most importantly, exclusive access to the profitable trade routes connecting Europe to Asia. The emperor thought he was hiring Venetian naval support for his wars against the Normans. What he was actually doing was handing Venice the keys to the medieval world's most lucrative economic opportunity. The Golden Bull of 1082, as historians call this agreement, transformed Venice from a successful regional trading power into the dominant force in international commerce. But the real genius wasn't in negotiating these privileges. It was in how Venice used them to fundamentally restructure the global economy in their favor. Before 1082, trade between East and West followed ancient patterns that had existed since Roman times. Byzantine merchants controlled the eastern markets, Italian city-states competed for Western access, and Arab traders dominated the crucial middle segments of transcontinental trade routes. Venice's new privileges allowed them to bypass this entire system. They could now purchase goods directly from producers in Constantinople, Alexandria, and other eastern cities, transport them efficiently to Western markets, and capture all the profit margins that had previously been divided among multiple intermediaries. But Venice didn't just exploit their new privileges, they systematically expanded them. Within a decade of the Golden Bull, Venetian merchants had established permanent trading posts in over 50 Byzantine cities. They had negotiated similar agreements with other Eastern rulers. They had created a network of commercial relationships that gave them preferred access to virtually every valuable trade route in the known world. The scale of what Venice accomplished was unprecedented. By 1100 CE, roughly 80% of all goods flowing between East and West passed through Venetian hands. They weren't just participating in international trade, they were international trade. The numbers reveal the magnitude of Venice's success. A single large Venetian trading expedition could generate more profit than most European kingdoms collected in annual taxes. The city's customs revenues exceeded the total government budgets of much larger territorial states. Individual Venetian merchant families accumulated wealth that rivaled the treasuries of major empires. But Venice's real innovation wasn't just in accumulating wealth, it was in creating financial systems that could efficiently manage and deploy that wealth to generate even greater returns. The challenge was logistical. Traditional medieval commerce operated on simple buy low, sell high principles with immediate cash transactions. But Venice's operations were becoming too large and complex for cash-based trading. They needed new financial instruments that could handle delayed payments, shared risks, and long-term investments across vast distances. Venice's solution was to invent modern commercial banking. Venetian merchants began offering financial services, currency exchange, commercial loans, credit arrangements, and investment partnerships that enabled much larger and more sophisticated trading operations. The breakthrough came with the development of what historians call the commenda, a revolutionary partnership structure that allowed multiple investors to pool their capital for large trading ventures, while sharing both risks and returns according to predetermined formulas. Here's how it worked. A wealthy Venetian investor would provide capital for a trading expedition. An experienced merchant would contribute expertise and management. Additional partners might contribute ships, warehouses, or political connections. When the expedition returned, profits would be divided according to each partner's contribution and risk exposure. The commenda system solved multiple problems simultaneously. It allowed Venice to finance larger trading operations than any individual merchant could afford. It distributed risks across multiple investors, reducing the chance that a single failed expedition could bankrupt its backers. And it created incentives for specialization, encouraging the development of professional classes focused on different aspects of commercial operations. More importantly, the commenda created something unprecedented, a liquid market for commercial investments. Instead of tying up capital in individual trading ventures for months or years, investors could buy and sell partnership shares, creating secondary markets that made commercial investments more attractive and accessible. By 1150, Venice had hundreds of active commenda partnerships operating simultaneously across dozens of trade routes. The total capital deployed through these partnerships exceeded the GDP of most European countries. Venice had essentially created the world's first stock market, centuries before anyone else thought to formalize such arrangements. But Venice's financial innovations went beyond just partnership structures. They were also pioneering new approaches to currency exchange, international payments, and commercial credit that would eventually revolutionize how money moved across borders. The problem was practical. Medieval Europe used dozens of different currency systems with constantly fluctuating exchange rates. A Venetian merchant might purchase goods in Constantinople with Byzantine bezants, transport them to London, where they would be sold for English pounds, then need to convert those pounds back to Venetian ducats for the next trading cycle. Managing these currency conversions was expensive, risky, and time-consuming. Small errors in exchange rate calculations could eliminate trading profits. Currency fluctuations could turn profitable expeditions into financial disasters. The complexity of multi-currency transactions limited the scale and scope of international trading operations. Venice solved this problem by creating the medieval world's first international banking network. Venetian banks established permanent offices in major trading cities across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. These offices could handle currency conversions, extend commercial credit, and facilitate international payments without requiring the physical transportation of coins and precious metals. The system worked through what we would now recognize as early forms of letters of credit and wire transfers. A Venetian merchant in Constantinople could deposit Byzantine coins with the local Venetian bank office and receive a letter of credit that could be redeemed for English pounds at the Venice bank office in London. This eliminated the risks and costs associated with transporting large amounts of currency across dangerous medieval trade routes. It also created float, the temporary use of deposited funds that Venetian banks could invest to generate additional profits while providing currency exchange services. By 1200, the Venetian banking network was handling international payments for merchants from dozens of countries. Non-Venetian traders increasingly depended on Venetian financial services to conduct their own international operations. Venice had become not just a trading power, but the essential financial infrastructure that made large-scale international commerce possible. The transformation was profound. Venice was no longer just selling goods, they were selling financial services. They were no longer just participating in markets, they were creating and controlling the mechanisms that made markets function efficiently. This evolution from trading to banking represented a fundamental shift in Venice's economic strategy. Instead of generating wealth through traditional commercial margins, they were generating wealth through financial intermediation. Instead of competing with other merchants for trading opportunities, they were providing the financial tools that enabled all merchants to operate more effectively. The shift was extraordinarily profitable. Financial services generated higher margins than physical trading, required less capital investment than maintaining large inventories, and created ongoing relationships with customers rather than one-time transactions. More importantly, providing financial services created network effects that strengthened Venice's competitive position. The more merchants who used Venetian banking services, the more valuable those services became to other potential users. The more international payments that flowed through Venetian networks, the more essential those networks became to global commerce. By 1250, Venice had achieved something unprecedented in medieval economics. They had created a business model that became more profitable and more defensible as it grew larger. Instead of facing the diminishing returns that limited most medieval enterprises, Venice's financial operations exhibited increasing returns to scale. The strategic implications were enormous. Venice was no longer just another successful trading city that might be displaced by competitors with better ships or more favorable geographic locations. They had become the essential financial infrastructure that connected the medieval global economy. Displacing Venice would now require not just building better ships or negotiating better trade agreements, but creating alternative financial networks sophisticated enough to handle international commerce at the scale that Venice had made possible. Chapter 3: Banking Revolution, 1171 CE. In a modest building overlooking Venice's Grand Canal, something was happening that would revolutionize global finance for the next 800 years. The Venetian government was issuing the world's first government bonds. They called them prestiti, forced loans that wealthy Venetians were required to purchase to fund the state's military and commercial operations. But these weren't simple IOUs that would be repaid when convenient. They were sophisticated financial instruments that paid regular interest, could be bought and sold in secondary markets, and created a new asset class that would eventually grow to dominate global financial markets. The innovation emerged from necessity. Venice's expanding commercial operations required massive capital investments, larger fleets, more warehouses, extensive port facilities, and permanent trading posts across 3 continents. Traditional taxation couldn't generate funds quickly enough or at sufficient scale to finance these investments. But Venice's merchant elite had accumulated enormous private wealth through their trading operations. The challenge was creating financial mechanisms that could mobilize this private capital for public purposes while providing attractive returns to investors. The prestiti system was Venice's brilliant solution. Instead of simply confiscating wealth through taxation, Venice would borrow it through voluntary purchases of government bonds that offered competitive investment returns. The bonds paid annual interest of 5%, higher than most alternative medieval investments, but lower than the risks associated with individual trading ventures. More importantly, the bonds were backed by Venice's growing customs revenues, making them significantly safer than other available investment opportunities. But the real innovation was making the bonds tradable. Unlike previous government loans that locked up investors' capital until maturity, Venetian prestiti could be bought and sold among private investors at market-determined prices. This created something unprecedented, a liquid market for government debt that allowed investors to maintain flexibility while still providing long-term capital to fund state operations. The economic implications were revolutionary. Venice had essentially created a method for converting illiquid government promises into liquid financial assets that investors could trade like any other commodity. Within a decade, a sophisticated bond market had emerged around the prestiti. Professional traders specialized in buying and selling government securities. Price fluctuations reflected changing assessments of Venice's creditworthiness and future earning capacity. Secondary market trading volumes often exceeded the value of new bond issuances, but Venice didn't stop with government bonds. The same financial engineering principles that made prestiti successful could be applied to private commercial ventures, creating new investment opportunities that would accelerate Venice's economic growth. The breakthrough came with the development of what historians call societas, joint stock companies that combined elements of the traditional commenda partnership with the tradable securities features of government bonds. Here's how it worked. Venice's largest trading operations would be organized as permanent companies with professional management and diversified investment portfolios. Instead of funding individual trading expeditions, investors would purchase shares in these companies that entitled them to proportional shares of all profits generated by the company's various commercial activities. The shares could be bought and sold in secondary markets, creating liquidity for investors while providing stable long-term capital for company operations. The companies could pursue multi-year strategies, maintain permanent infrastructure, and develop specialized expertise that gave them competitive advantages over smaller temporary partnerships. The societas represented a fundamental evolution in business organization. For the first time in history, commercial enterprises could separate ownership from management, raise capital from passive investors, and pursue strategies that extended beyond the lifespan or risk tolerance of any individual merchant. By 1200, Venice had dozens of active societas companies operating across different sectors of the economy. The largest companies employed hundreds of people, operated fleets of over 100 ships, and maintained permanent facilities in more than 50 cities across Europe, Asia, and Africa. But the real breakthrough was how these companies used their access to capital markets to pursue strategies that were impossible for traditional merchant partnerships. The Arsenal of Venice provides the perfect example. Founded in 1104 as a state-sponsored shipbuilding facility, the Arsenal evolved into something unprecedented, the world's first industrial corporation. Instead of building ships one at a time using traditional craft methods, The arsenal implemented standardized production processes that could build multiple ships simultaneously using interchangeable parts and specialized labor. The innovation wasn't just technological, it was financial. The arsenal's standardized production methods required massive upfront investments in facilities, tools, and worker training that no individual merchant could afford. But by organizing as a societas and selling shares to multiple investors, the arsenal could raise sufficient capital to implement production methods that dramatically reduced per-unit costs while increasing quality and reliability. The results were extraordinary. By 1250, the arsenal was producing ships faster and cheaper than any other shipbuilding operation in the world. Venice's fleet became the largest and most technologically advanced in the Mediterranean. The cost advantages generated by industrial production methods enabled Venice to offer shipping services at prices that smaller competitors couldn't match. More importantly, the arsenal demonstrated how financial innovation could enable technological innovation. The availability of patient capital through equity markets allowed Venice to pursue long-term investments in productivity improvements that generated competitive advantages for decades. This lesson was applied across Venice's economy. Venetian companies used access to capital markets to fund innovations in glass manufacturing, textile production, metallurgy, and other sectors that created exportable products and import substitutes. By 1300, Venice was no longer just a trading intermediary. They were a diversified economic power that combined commercial, financial, and manufacturing capabilities in ways that no other medieval society had achieved. But Venice's most sophisticated financial innovation was still to come. The same principles that had enabled successful government bonds and joint stock companies could be applied to international finance, creating new mechanisms for facilitating global trade and capturing profits from currency exchange and international payments. The innovation emerged from Venice's growing role as the financial center for international commerce. Merchants from across Europe and the Mediterranean were increasingly using Venetian banks to handle currency conversions, commercial credit, and international payments. But these services were generating transaction fees rather than the higher profits available through principal investing. Venice needed methods for using their accumulated capital and financial expertise to generate returns from international financial flows beyond just service charges. The solution was revolutionary. Venice began offering what we would now recognize as international trade finance and foreign exchange trading as profit centers rather than just customer services. Instead of simply facilitating currency conversions for a fee, Venetian banks began taking positions in foreign exchange markets, profiting from their superior information about international trade flows and currency supply and demand. Instead of just extending commercial credit to facilitate individual transactions, Venetian banks began offering structured finance products that allowed them to participate in the profits generated by international trading operations. Chapter 3. Banking Revolution. Instead of just providing international payment services, Venetian banks began creating financial instruments that bundled and securitized international trade receivables, creating new asset classes that could be sold to investors. These innovations transformed Venice from a provider of financial services into a principal participant in international financial markets. They were no longer just facilitating other people's transactions. They were using their capital and expertise to generate profits from the underlying economic activities that those transactions represented. The profits were enormous. By 1350, Venice's financial operations were generating returns that exceeded their traditional trading profits. The city had evolved from a commercial power into a financial power that could profit from economic activity anywhere in the world where they had relationships and information. But the most important aspect of Venice's financial revolution wasn't just the profits it generated. It was how it changed the fundamental nature of economic power in the medieval world. Traditional medieval power was based on controlling territory, collecting taxes from agricultural production, and extracting tribute through military conquest. Venice had created a new form of power based on controlling financial flows, generating profits from commercial intermediation, and leveraging information advantages to capitalize on economic opportunities. This new model was more scalable more flexible and more profitable than traditional territorial power. It could adapt quickly to changing economic conditions, expand into new markets without military conquest, and generate wealth from other people's economic activity rather than requiring direct control over productive resources. Most importantly, Venice's financial innovations created network effects that strengthened their competitive position. The more international commerce that flowed through Venetian financial networks, the more valuable those networks became to potential users. The more information Venice accumulated about global economic conditions, the better they became at identifying and capitalizing on profitable opportunities. By 1400, Venice had created something unprecedented in human history, a form of economic organization that could generate wealth from managing and facilitating other people's economic activities on a global scale. The implications extended far beyond Venice itself. The financial tools and business models that Venice pioneered would eventually spread to other cities and countries, creating the foundation for modern capitalism and global financial markets. But in the medieval period, Venice's financial innovations gave them an almost insurmountable competitive advantage. They had essentially created the world's first modern economy in a world where everyone else was still operating according to feudal principles. The question was whether they could maintain their financial advantages long enough to cement their position as the permanent center of global economic activity, or whether their innovations would eventually be copied and improved upon by competitors with different strategic advantages. Chapter 4. Maritime Monopoly, 1204 CE. Constantinople, the greatest city in the world, was burning. But this wasn't a barbarian invasion or a natural disaster. This was something far more calculated and devastating. The world's first corporate-sponsored military conquest, financed and directed by Venetian merchants who had turned the Fourth Crusade into the most profitable business venture in medieval history. When Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem, he envisioned armies of faithful knights sailing directly to the Holy Land to fight the Muslims. What he got instead was a Venetian-controlled expedition that conquered the richest Christian city in the world and delivered its wealth to Venice's treasure houses. The transformation of the Fourth Crusade revealed the true extent of Venice's power and their willingness to use that power in ways that would reshape the medieval world according to their commercial interests. The story began with a simple business proposition. The crusading armies needed ships to transport 35,000 soldiers to the Holy Land. Venice was the only maritime power with sufficient shipbuilding capacity to provide the necessary transportation. Doge Enrico Dandolo, Venice's blind but brilliant leader, negotiated what appeared to be a straightforward commercial contract. Venice would provide transportation for 85,000 silver marks, an enormous sum that would require the Crusaders to mortgage their kingdoms to afford the passage. But Dandolo had structured the deal to ensure that the Crusaders couldn't meet their payment obligations without Venetian assistance. When the armies assembled in Venice in 1202, they had raised only 51,000 of the 85,000 marks required for transportation. Instead of cancelling the expedition or reducing the scope of transportation services, Dandolo proposed an alternative payment arrangement. The Crusaders would help Venice capture Zara, a competing Adriatic port that had been disrupting Venetian trade routes. The capture of Zara was accomplished quickly and efficiently, but it created new complications. The Pope excommunicated the entire expedition for attacking a Christian city. More importantly, the Crusaders still owed Venice substantial money that they couldn't repay through normal means. Dandolo's solution was audacious beyond imagination. The expedition would attack Constantinople itself, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and Venice's primary trading partner for over 200 years. The decision wasn't made in anger or religious fervor. It was a calculated business decision based on detailed financial analysis of the potential returns from conquering the richest city in the medieval world. Venice had accumulated detailed intelligence about Constantinople's wealth through centuries of trading relationships. They knew the locations of the imperial treasuries, the value of the city's religious artifacts, and the economic potential of the Byzantine Empire's territories. More importantly, Venice understood that conquering Constantinople would eliminate their most powerful potential competitor and give them complete control over trade routes between Europe and Asia. The siege and capture of Constantinople in April 1204 was one of the most devastating events in medieval history. The city that had preserved Greek learning and Roman law for 1,000 years was systematically looted by armies that Venice had transported and equipped for that specific purpose. But the looting wasn't random vandalism. It was organized wealth extraction conducted according to predetermined formulas that Venice had negotiated before the attack began. Venice received 1/4 of all treasure captured in the city, plus 3/8 of all Byzantine territories conquered by the expedition. More importantly, they received complete commercial control over the conquered empire's trade routes and ports. The immediate financial returns were staggering. Venice's share of Constantinople's treasure exceeded the total wealth that the city had accumulated through 2 centuries of successful trading. Individual Venetian merchants became wealthier than most European kings. But the real value wasn't in the immediate loot. It was in the long-term commercial advantages that Venice had purchased through their investment in military conquest. The conquest of Constantinople eliminated the Byzantine Empire as an independent economic power and replaced it with a series of weak crusader states that depended on Venetian financial and logistical support for their survival. Venice now controlled both ends of the most profitable trade routes in the medieval world: the Western European markets, where Eastern goods commanded premium prices, and the Eastern sources, where those goods could be purchased at production costs. They had essentially created a vertically integrated supply chain that spanned 3 continents and eliminated most of their potential competitors through a single military operation. The strategic implications were profound. Venice was no longer just another successful trading city competing with rivals for market share. They had become the dominant economic power in the Eastern Mediterranean, with quasi-monopolistic control over transcontinental trade. The numbers reveal the magnitude of Venice's success. Between 1204 and 1250, Venetian trade volumes increased by over 400%. The city's population grew from 85,000 to 120,000 as merchants and craftspeople from across Europe migrated to participate in Venice's expanding economy. Government revenues increased so dramatically that Venice could afford to fund massive infrastructure projects while maintaining the largest navy in the Mediterranean and still accumulating financial reserves that exceeded most national treasuries. But Venice's monopolistic position created new challenges. Success attracted attention from potential competitors who wanted to share in the enormous profits generated by Eastern trade. Military success encouraged other powers to consider whether they could use force to break Venice's commercial dominance. Venice's response revealed their sophisticated understanding of how to maintain competitive advantages in a world where other powers were actively trying to undermine their position. Instead of trying to maintain their advantages through military force alone, Venice systematically strengthened their economic position by developing new capabilities that would be difficult for competitors to replicate. They used their accumulated wealth to fund technological innovations that improved their operational efficiency. Venetian shipbuilders developed new vessel designs that could carry more cargo while requiring smaller crews. Venetian manufacturers developed new production techniques that created high-value exports that commanded premium prices in international markets. Most importantly, Venice began diversifying their economic activities beyond just trading Eastern goods to Western markets. They developed banking operations that could profit from facilitating other people's commercial activities. They created manufacturing capabilities that could generate wealth from adding value to raw materials. They established service industries that could capture profits from their accumulated expertise and infrastructure. The diversification strategy was brilliantly executed. By 1300, Venice was no longer dependent on any single source of revenue or vulnerable to disruption of any single trade route. Their banking operations were generating profits from commercial activities across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Their manufacturing operations were producing goods that were sold in markets from London to Cairo. Their shipping services were used by merchants from dozens of countries who lacked the capacity to handle their own international transportation needs. Venice had evolved from a trading monopoly into a diversified economic ecosystem that could generate wealth from multiple sources simultaneously. But perhaps the most important aspect of Venice's maritime monopoly was how it enabled them to develop new forms of business organization that would eventually spread throughout the global economy. The scale and complexity of Venice's operations required coordination mechanisms that were more sophisticated than traditional medieval business practices could provide. Venice pioneered what we would now recognize as modern corporate management, professional hierarchies, specialized departments, standardized procedures, and systematic reporting systems that enabled large organizations to operate efficiently across vast distances and cultural differences. These innovations weren't just internal efficiency improvements, they created new capabilities that gave Venice advantages in every market where they operated. Venetian companies could pursue long-term strategies that smaller competitors couldn't afford to implement. They could diversify risks across multiple markets and activities in ways that made them more resilient during economic downturns. They could develop specialized expertise that enabled them to offer superior products and services in competitive markets. By 1350, Venice had created what we would now recognize as the world's first multinational corporations, business organizations that operated across multiple countries, currencies, and legal systems while maintaining unified strategic direction and operational coordination. These corporations were generating wealth and wielding influence that exceeded many sovereign governments. The largest Venetian trading companies had larger budgets than most European kingdoms and more sophisticated intelligence networks than most royal governments. But the success of Venice's maritime monopoly also contained the seeds of its eventual limitations. The same innovations that gave Venice competitive advantages would eventually be copied and improved upon by competitors with different strategic assets. The financial tools that Venice developed to fund their expansion would eventually enable other powers to finance competing operations. The business models that Venice pioneered would eventually be adopted by merchants in other cities who could offer similar services at competitive prices. Most importantly, Venice's success would eventually encourage other powers to develop alternative trade routes and commercial networks that could bypass Venetian control entirely. The question facing Venice by 1400 was whether they could continue innovating faster than their competitors could copy their existing innovations, or whether the maritime monopoly that had made them wealthy would eventually be undermined by the spread of the same capabilities that had created their advantages in the first place. Chapter 5. Financial Innovation 1345 CE. In the Rialto district of Venice, something unprecedented was happening that would transform global economics forever. The world's first commodity exchange was opening for business. This wasn't just a marketplace where merchants could buy and sell goods. This was a sophisticated financial institution where investors could trade contracts for future delivery of commodities, hedge against price fluctuations, and speculate on market movements using financial instruments that wouldn't be fully understood by economists for another 600 years. The Venetian Commodity Exchange represented the culmination of centuries of financial innovation that had transformed Venice from a simple trading city into the world's first modern financial center. But the exchange was just the visible manifestation of a much deeper transformation in how Venice approached wealth creation and risk management. Behind the scenes, Venetian financiers were developing new mathematical tools, new accounting methods, and new business concepts that would eventually become the foundation of modern capitalism. The innovation began with a practical problem. Venice's trading operations had become so large and complex that traditional methods of financing and risk management were no longer adequate. A typical major Venetian trading expedition in 1345 might involve 20 ships, 500 crew members, and cargo worth over 100,000 ducats, more than the annual budget of most European kingdoms. The expedition might visit 15 different ports, conduct business in 8 different currencies, and take 18 months to complete a full trading cycle. Managing the financial risks associated with such operations required more sophisticated tools than the simple partnership agreements and cash transactions that had sufficed for smaller medieval trading ventures. Venice needed methods for financing large operations without requiring individual investors to provide enormous amounts of capital. They needed ways to hedge against currency fluctuations, weather delays, and political disruptions that could turn profitable expeditions into financial disasters. They needed mechanisms for sharing risks among multiple parties while providing appropriate returns to each participant. The solutions that Venice developed would fundamentally change how financial markets operated throughout the world. The first breakthrough was the development of standardized commodity contracts that could be bought and sold before the underlying goods were actually produced or delivered. Here's how it worked. A Venetian merchant planning to purchase spices in Alexandria could sell contracts for those spices to buyers in London months before the expedition departed Venice. The London buyers would pay a predetermined price for delivery of specified quantities and qualities of spices at a future date. This system benefited everyone involved. The London buyers secured guaranteed access to Eastern goods at predictable prices. The Venetian merchant received cash up front that could be used to finance the expedition. Both parties eliminated the risks associated with price fluctuations between the time the expedition was planned and the time the goods were actually delivered. But the real innovation was making these contracts tradable. Instead of locking buyers and sellers into fixed agreements, Venice created secondary markets where commodity contracts could be bought and sold among investors who might never intend to take physical delivery of the underlying goods. This created something unprecedented, a financial market where the value of contracts was determined by investors' assessments of future supply and demand conditions rather than just current market prices. Sophisticated investors could purchase contracts when they believed future prices would be higher than current contract prices, then sell those contracts at a profit when market conditions changed. Merchants could use contract markets to hedge against adverse price movements that might eliminate their trading profits. The commodity exchange became a mechanism for distributing risks among investors who were best positioned to bear them while providing price discovery services that made markets more efficient for everyone. But Venice's financial innovations went far beyond just commodity contracts. They were also developing new approaches to banking, credit, and international finance that would revolutionize how money moved across borders and how commercial ventures were funded. The breakthrough was Venice's creation of what we would now recognize as international correspondent banking networks. Instead of relying on physical transportation of coins and precious metals to conduct international business, Venice developed systems where financial obligations could be transferred through bookkeeping entries across multiple banking institutions. The innovation solved multiple problems simultaneously. It reduced the costs and risks associated with transporting valuable currencies across dangerous medieval trade routes. It accelerated the speed of international transactions by eliminating the time required for physical transportation. It created opportunities for banks to profit from currency exchange and credit services rather than just facilitating payments. Most importantly, it enabled much larger and more complex international trading operations by providing reliable mechanisms for financing and settlement that didn't depend on cumbersome physical commodity exchanges. By 1350, Venice's correspondent banking network included permanent relationships with financial institutions in over 100 cities across Europe, Asia, and Africa. A Venetian merchant could deposit ducats in Venice and withdraw local currency in Cairo, London, or Constantinople through letters of credit that were honored by partner banks throughout the known world. The network effects were powerful. The more cities that joined Venice's correspondent banking system, the more valuable that system became to merchants conducting international business. The more international payments that flowed through Venetian networks, the more information Venice accumulated about global economic conditions and trading opportunities. Venice had essentially created the medieval equivalent of the modern international banking system, with themselves at the center of all major financial flows. But perhaps Venice's most revolutionary financial innovation was their development of what historians call public debt markets, sophisticated mechanisms for government financing that would eventually become the foundation of modern government bond markets. The innovation emerged from Venice's need to finance large-scale military and infrastructure investments without imposing excessive taxes that might discourage commercial activity. Traditional medieval governments financed extraordinary expenses, through special taxes, forced loans, or confiscation of private property. These methods were economically disruptive and politically destabilizing, often causing more damage to the economy than the benefits generated by the spending they financed. Venice developed a more sophisticated approach. Instead of forcing immediate payment of extraordinary expenses, Venice would issue interest-bearing debt instruments that could be purchased voluntarily by investors, seeking attractive returns on their accumulated wealth. The key innovation was making government debt tradable in secondary markets. Investors who purchased government bonds weren't locked into holding them until maturity. They could sell their bonds to other investors at market-determined prices that reflected changing assessments of Venice's creditworthiness and future earning capacity. This created a liquid market for government debt that provided flexibility for investors while enabling the government to access long-term capital for strategic investments. The system was extraordinarily successful. Venice's government bonds consistently traded at prices that implied interest rates lower than those available on most alternative investments, reflecting investors' confidence in Venice's ability to service its debts through growing commercial revenues. More importantly, the bond market created a new asset class that could absorb the large amounts of capital that Venice's merchants were accumulating through their trading activities. Instead of searching for increasingly risky trading opportunities to deploy their wealth, Venetian investors could purchase government bonds that provided steady returns while supporting the infrastructure investments that made their trading activities more profitable. By 1400, Venice's public debt markets were so sophisticated that they included multiple classes of bonds with different maturity dates, interest rates, and risk characteristics. Professional bond traders specialized in arbitraging price differences between different bond issues. Institutional investors developed portfolio strategies that balanced government bonds against commodity contracts, trading company shares, and real estate investments. Venice had created what was essentially a modern financial market, centuries before other societies developed the institutions and expertise needed to operate such systems. But the most important aspect of Venice's financial innovations wasn't just their technical sophistication. It was how they changed the fundamental relationship between government and economic activity. Traditional medieval governments were extractive institutions that consumed economic resources through taxation and regulation. Venice had created a symbiotic relationship where government activities were designed to support and enhance private economic activities that generated the revenues needed to service government debts. This alignment of incentives encouraged Venice's government to pursue policies that maximized long-term economic growth rather than short-term revenue extraction. It created a virtuous cycle where successful private economic activity generated government revenues that funded infrastructure investments that supported even more successful private economic activity. The model was so successful that it eventually spread to other Italian city-states and then throughout Europe, creating the foundation for modern relationships between governments and financial markets. But Venice's financial innovations also created new vulnerabilities. The sophistication of their financial systems made them dependent on continued confidence from investors and trading partners. The complexity of their operations made them vulnerable to disruptions that might cascade through interconnected markets and institutions. Most importantly, the success of their financial innovations encouraged competitors to develop alternative systems that could challenge Venice's dominance of international finance. The question facing Venice by 1450 was whether their financial innovations had created sustainable competitive advantages or whether they had simply accelerated the development of global financial markets that would eventually route around Venetian control. Chapter 6. Peak Power, 1423 CE. In the Doge's palace overlooking the Grand Canal, Francesco Foscari was being inaugurated as Venice's new leader, and he was inheriting the most powerful economic empire in human history. At its peak, Venice controlled roughly 60% of all international trade flowing between East and West. The city's treasury contained more gold and silver than most national governments. Venetian merchants operated permanent trading posts in over 150 cities across 4 continents. Their financial networks extended from London to Beijing, from Novgorod to Alexandria. A single Venetian trading company now employed more people than many European armies. The largest Venetian banks had more capital than most kingdoms. Venice's shipyards could build vessels faster than entire nations could commission them. But the numbers only hint at the true extent of Venice's dominance. They had become something unprecedented in medieval society, a commercial empire that wielded economic power equivalent to military conquest without requiring the vast territorial holdings that limited traditional empires. Venice in 1423 was generating more wealth per capita than any society before or since. The average Venetian citizen was 20 times wealthier than the average European. Venetian merchants routinely made decisions that affected economic conditions across 3 continents. Venice's government collected more revenue from customs duties than most countries collected from all sources combined. But Venice's peak power wasn't just about wealth. It was about their unprecedented ability to shape global economic conditions according to their own interests. When Venice wanted to punish a rival trading city, they could organize boycotts that eliminated that city's access to Eastern markets. When Venice needed to pressure a foreign government, they could manipulate currency exchange rates and commercial credit to create economic crises that were more devastating than military invasions. When Venice identified promising new trade routes or market opportunities, they could deploy capital and expertise at scales that made it impossible for competitors to challenge their dominance. The scope of Venice's influence was extraordinary. Political decisions in kingdoms across Europe were evaluated based on their potential impact on relationships with Venetian merchants. Foreign rulers competed to offer Venice favorable trading terms that might attract Venetian investment to their territories. Major commercial centers from London to Constantinople had developed economies that were fundamentally dependent on access to Venetian financial services and trading networks. Disrupting relationships with Venice could cause economic disruptions that threatened political stability throughout large regions. Venice had achieved what we would now recognize as economic hegemony, the ability to set global economic rules and enforce them through financial rather than military means. The foundation of this hegemony was Venice's unmatched combination of commercial expertise, financial sophistication, and operational capabilities. No other medieval society had developed the institutional knowledge needed to conduct international commerce at the scale and complexity that Venice handled routinely. No other financial system could provide the credit, currency exchange, and risk management services that made large-scale international trade possible. Most importantly, no other power had developed the network effects that made Venice increasingly valuable to potential partners, while making it increasingly difficult for competitors to offer equivalent alternatives. The more international commerce that flowed through Venetian networks, the more information Venice accumulated about global market conditions and trading opportunities. The more foreign merchants who used Venetian financial services, the more attractive those services became to other potential users. Venice had created a self-reinforcing system where success generated capabilities that enabled even greater success. But Venice's peak power was also built on innovations that went beyond traditional commercial and financial activities. They had developed new forms of industrial organization that enabled them to produce manufactured goods at scales and efficiencies that no other medieval society could match. The Arsenal of Venice had evolved into what historians recognize as the world's first modern industrial complex. By 1420, the arsenal employed over 16,000 workers using standardized production methods that could build a complete warship in a single day. The industrial innovations weren't limited to shipbuilding. Venice had developed mass production techniques for glass manufacturing, textile production, and metalworking that enabled them to produce high-quality goods at prices that undercut competitors throughout Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. These manufactured goods provided Venice with new sources of revenue that weren't dependent on their traditional role as intermediaries in East-West trade. They were creating value through industrial production rather than just capturing value through commercial arbitrage. More importantly, Venice's industrial capabilities created new forms of competitive advantage that were even more difficult for competitors to replicate than their commercial and financial innovations. Building industrial production capabilities required not just capital investment, but also technical expertise, skilled labor forces, and supply chain management capabilities that took decades to develop. Countries that wanted to compete with Venetian manufacturers would need to make sustained investments in education, infrastructure, and technology development that few medieval societies were capable of organizing or financing. Venice's industrial dominance was further reinforced by their ability to integrate manufacturing with their existing commercial and financial capabilities. Venetian manufacturers had better access to raw materials through the city's trading networks. They had better access to capital through Venice's financial markets. They had better access to customers through the city's international commercial relationships. By 1450, Venice was operating what we would now recognize as the world's first integrated global economy, a system that combined raw material sourcing, industrial production, international distribution, financial services, and market development into a coordinated operation that spanned multiple continents. But Venice's peak power was also characterized by their development of soft power capabilities that enabled them to influence global affairs through cultural and intellectual leadership rather than just economic dominance. Venice had become the center of Renaissance humanism and artistic innovation. The city's wealth enabled unprecedented patronage of arts, literature, and scholarship that attracted the most talented individuals from across Europe. Venetian universities were producing advances in mathematics, navigation, cartography, and other fields that provided practical advantages for commercial and financial operations. Venetian printing presses were disseminating new ideas and information throughout Europe faster than any other communication network. Venice's cultural influence created additional network effects that strengthened their economic position. Foreign scholars and artists who studied in Venice often returned to their home countries with preferences for Venetian goods and business practices. Foreign rulers who admired Venetian achievements often sought to emulate Venetian policies and institutions. The combination of economic, industrial, financial, and cultural leadership made Venice's influence remarkably pervasive and resilient. They weren't just dominating global commerce, they were shaping how other societies thought about commerce, finance, and economic organization. But Venice's peak power also revealed the limitations and vulnerabilities that would eventually undermine their dominance. The scale and complexity of Venice's operations had made them dependent on continued political stability and commercial cooperation from dozens of foreign governments. Any significant disruption to their international relationships could cause cascading effects throughout their interconnected commercial and financial networks. More importantly, Venice's success was encouraging competitors to develop alternative systems that could challenge their dominance. Other Italian city-states were copying Venetian innovations and applying them to compete for the same markets and trading opportunities. Northern European powers were developing new maritime capabilities that could bypass Venetian control of traditional trade routes. Asian and Middle Eastern rulers were beginning to understand how Venetian commercial practices worked and developing strategies to capture more of the value created by international trade. Most significantly, the same technological and organizational innovations that had enabled Venice's rise were becoming available to potential competitors who might use them more effectively than Venice could maintain their advantages. The printing press was spreading commercial and technical knowledge that had previously been confined to Venetian merchant families. Improvements in navigation and shipbuilding were making it easier for other powers to develop their own international trading capabilities. Financial innovations that Venice had pioneered were being adopted by other cities and countries that could offer competitive services without the premium prices that Venice charged for their historical dominance. By 1450, Venice was facing the challenge that eventually confronts all dominant powers. Their innovations had created new possibilities that other societies could exploit to challenge their continuing dominance. The question was whether Venice could continue innovating faster than their competitors, could copy their existing advantages, or whether their peak power represented the beginning of a gradual decline as the world caught up with their innovations and developed alternative approaches to achieving similar results. The signs of potential challenge were already visible. Portuguese explorers were developing direct sea routes to Asia that could bypass Venice entirely. Ottoman expansion was threatening Venice's traditional Eastern trading partners. Northern European merchants were developing new financial techniques that could compete with Venetian banking services. Venice's response to these emerging challenges would determine whether their peak power could be sustained or whether it represented the high point of an empire that was about to face the same fate as all previous dominant powers throughout history. Chapter 7. Merchant Princes, 1453 CE. The news reached Venice on a sunny morning in June, carried by a fast galley that had raced across the eastern Mediterranean at maximum speed. Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks. For most of Europe, this was a catastrophic blow to Christianity and the end of the thousand-year Byzantine Empire. For Venice, it was something far more complex: the destruction of their most important trading partner and the emergence of a new power that might either destroy their eastern commerce entirely or become an even more profitable partner than the Byzantines had ever been. The man who would navigate this crisis was Francesco Foscari, but the real power lay with Venice's merchant princes, the dozen or so families who had accumulated wealth and influence that exceeded most European royalty, and who now controlled the most sophisticated commercial and financial networks in the world. These weren't just successful businessmen. They were a new form of elite that had emerged from Venice's unique political and economic system. Individuals who wielded power through commercial networks rather than territorial control, who influenced international affairs through financial leverage rather than military force, and who had created new forms of wealth that were more liquid, more scalable, and more durable than traditional aristocratic holdings. The Medici family in Florence had pioneered international banking, but Venice's merchant princes had taken commercial finance to entirely new levels of sophistication and global reach. The Contarini family controlled trading networks that extended from Bruges to Trebizond, from Tanna to Alexandria. Their annual revenues exceeded those of most kingdoms, and their commercial intelligence network provided them with information about economic and political conditions across the known world weeks or months before that information reached royal courts. The Morosini family had evolved from ship owners into the operators of what was essentially a global logistics corporation. They owned over 200 vessels, maintained permanent facilities in 80 cities, and could move goods from production sources to final markets faster and more reliably than any competitor. The Grimani family had built the most sophisticated international banking operation in history, with the ability to transfer funds, provide commercial credit, and manage currency exchange across 4 continents through a network of correspondent relationships and subsidiary operations. But perhaps the most powerful was the Cornaro family, who had transcended traditional commerce entirely and become what we might recognize as the world's first private equity empire. Instead of just trading goods or providing financial services, the Cornaro family used their accumulated capital to acquire ownership stakes in productive assets, mines, farms, manufacturing operations, and entire commercial enterprises that generated ongoing revenues independent of any particular transaction or relationship. They owned sugar plantations in Cyprus, silver mines in Bohemia, textile operations in Flanders, and shipping companies that operated throughout the Mediterranean. Their investment portfolio was generating returns that compounded annually while providing diversification that protected them against disruptions in any particular market or industry. The Cornaro family had essentially created the world's first modern investment firm, an organization that used financial engineering to acquire and manage productive assets for the purpose of generating maximum risk-adjusted returns over long time periods. These merchant princes represented something unprecedented in medieval society. They had accumulated wealth that exceeded royal treasuries, but they had done it through commercial innovation rather than inheritance or conquest. They wielded influence that affected international affairs, but they exercised that influence through economic networks rather than military forces. Most importantly, they had created new forms of capital that were more mobile, more flexible, and more productive than the land-based wealth that had traditionally defined elite status. A traditional medieval aristocrat derived power from controlling specific territories and the people who lived on them. But that power was geographically limited and vulnerable to military conquest or political changes that could eliminate the aristocrats' holdings entirely. Venice's merchant princes derived power from controlling commercial and financial networks that spanned multiple countries and continents. That power was geographically diversified and resilient against any particular political or military disruption. More importantly, their wealth was actively growing through reinvestment and compound returns, rather than just being preserved through defensive strategies. But the merchant princes' power also created new vulnerabilities and tensions within Venetian society. The concentration of commercial and financial power in a few families was generating inequality that threatened the social cohesion that had enabled Venice's political stability. Young Venetians without family connections to established merchant networks found it increasingly difficult to accumulate the capital needed to compete in international commerce. Traditional Venetian institutions were struggling to adapt to the scale and complexity of operations that the merchant princes were managing. The political systems that had worked well for a city of 100,000 people conducting regional trade were proving inadequate for coordinating global commercial empires that affected economic conditions across multiple continents. Most importantly, the merchant princes were beginning to pursue individual interests that sometimes conflicted with Venice's collective welfare. The Cornaro family's sugar plantations in Cyprus generated enormous profits, but they also created conflicts with Venetian foreign policy toward the Ottoman Empire. The Grimani family's banking operations in Northern Europe sometimes supported Venetian competitors who were using access to Venetian financial services to develop alternative trading networks. The merchant princes were becoming so powerful that they could pursue strategies that served their family interests, even when those strategies might undermine Venice's broader commercial dominance. The crisis came to a head in 1463 when the Ottoman Empire imposed new restrictions on Venetian trading privileges in the Eastern Mediterranean. The restrictions threatened to eliminate much of the Eastern commerce that had made Venice wealthy, but they affected different merchant families in different ways. Families with diversified international operations could adapt to reduced Eastern trade by expanding their activities in other regions. Families that specialized in traditional East-West commerce faced potential financial ruin if they couldn't negotiate continued access to Ottoman markets. The resulting political crisis revealed the tension between individual merchant family interests and Venice's collective strategic position. Some merchant princes advocated military resistance to Ottoman restrictions, arguing that Venice should use its naval power to force continued access to Eastern markets. Other merchant princes preferred diplomatic accommodation with the Ottomans, arguing that adaptation to new political realities was more profitable than attempting to maintain outdated commercial arrangements through force. The debate was ultimately resolved through characteristically Venetian pragmatism. Instead of choosing between military resistance and diplomatic accommodation, Venice would pursue both strategies simultaneously while accelerating the development of alternative commercial opportunities that could reduce their dependence on any particular trading relationship. The solution required unprecedented coordination among the merchant princes, who had to subordinate some of their individual family interests to Venice's collective strategic needs. The Contarini family agreed to redirect some of their Eastern trading capital toward developing new commercial relationships in Northern Europe and the Atlantic. The Morosini family agreed to use their shipping capabilities to support alternative trade routes that bypassed Ottoman-controlled territories. Most importantly, the Grimani and Cornaro families agreed to pool some of their financial resources to fund new industrial and commercial ventures that could generate wealth through production and innovation, rather than just traditional trading arbitrage. The coordination effort was successful enough to maintain Venice's prosperity, even as their traditional Eastern commerce declined. But it also revealed that Venice's merchant princes had become so powerful that their cooperation was essential for Venice's continued success. Venice was no longer just a city that happened to be home to successful merchants. It had become a political entity that existed primarily to coordinate and support the global commercial activities of its merchant prince families. The transformation was profound. Venice had evolved from a territorial state into something unprecedented, a commercial confederation that existed to serve the interests of its merchant elite rather than the other way around. This new form of political organization was extraordinarily effective at generating wealth and projecting economic influence across vast distances. But it was also inherently fragile because it depended on continued cooperation among powerful families who had the resources to pursue independent strategies if cooperation became inconvenient. The merchant princes had made Venice wealthy and powerful, beyond anything that traditional medieval political structures could have achieved. But they had also created a new form of state that was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before, a political entity whose primary purpose was facilitating commercial and financial activities rather than controlling territory or populations. The question facing Venice by 1500 was whether this new form of commercial state could adapt to changing global conditions quickly enough to maintain its advantages, or whether the merchant prince's individual pursuit of maximum profits would eventually fragment the cooperation that had made their collective success possible. Chapter 7. Merchant Princes. Chapter 8. Decline-Fall 1498 CE. In a small Portuguese port, Vasco da Gama's ships were returning from their historic voyage around Africa to India, their holds filled with spices that had been purchased directly from Asian producers for a fraction of what Venetian merchants charged European buyers. The age of Venetian commercial dominance was over. Da Gama's voyage represented more than just an alternative trade route. It was the beginning of a new era where oceanic navigation would replace Mediterranean commerce as the foundation of global trade. The geographic advantages that had made Venice wealthy for 800 years were becoming irrelevant almost overnight. But Venice's decline wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a gradual erosion that took nearly 300 years to complete, revealing how difficult it is for even the most sophisticated commercial powers to adapt when fundamental technological and geographic changes undermine their core competitive advantages. The Portuguese breakthrough was devastating to Venice because it eliminated their most important source of competitive advantage: control over trade routes between East and West. For centuries, Venice had profited from the fact that goods from Asia had to travel overland through the Middle East or across the Eastern Mediterranean before reaching European markets. This geographic bottleneck enabled Venice to control pricing, manage supply chains, and capture profit margins that could reach 1,000% or more. Direct oceanic trade routes eliminated these bottlenecks entirely. Portuguese merchants could purchase spices in India for the same prices that Venetian merchants paid, but they could transport them directly to European markets without paying any of the intermediary costs that made Venetian operations expensive. The price differential was enormous. Pepper that cost 10 ducats per pound when purchased through Venetian trading networks could be offered for 3 ducats per pound by Portuguese merchants who had eliminated all the intermediary markups. Venice tried desperately to compete by reducing their own profit margins, but they faced a fundamental problem. Their entire commercial infrastructure was designed for high-margin operations that could justify the costs of maintaining complex trading networks across multiple countries and currencies. When profit margins collapsed, Venice could no longer afford to maintain the extensive commercial and financial infrastructure that had enabled their dominance. They had to reduce operations, eliminate unprofitable routes, and abandon markets where they couldn't generate adequate returns. The downsizing created a vicious cycle. As Venice reduced their operations, they became less valuable to trading partners who began developing relationships with alternative suppliers. As they lost market share, their remaining operations became even less profitable because fixed costs were distributed across smaller volumes. But Venice's decline wasn't just about losing market share to Portuguese competition. They were also facing new challenges from Northern European powers that had learned from Venetian innovations and were applying them to develop competing commercial and financial capabilities. Dutch merchants had created their own East India Company that combined Venetian-style financial engineering with Portuguese-style oceanic navigation to develop trading operations that were larger and more efficient than anything Venice could maintain. English merchants were developing their own international banking capabilities that could provide many of the same services that Venetian banks had pioneered, but with lower costs and fewer restrictions. German and Flemish manufacturers were using new production techniques to create goods that competed directly with traditional Venetian exports, while offering better quality at lower prices. Venice was facing competition from multiple directions simultaneously, and their competitors were using innovations that Venice had pioneered against them. The irony was profound. Venice's decline was caused partly by the success of their own innovations. The commercial and financial techniques that they had developed to create their dominance had spread throughout Europe and were being used by competitors who had different strategic advantages. Portuguese navigational capabilities, combined with Venetian commercial techniques, created trading operations that were more efficient than anything Venice could offer. Dutch financial engineering, combined with Northern European manufacturing capabilities, created economic systems that were more productive than Venice's traditional approach. Venice had become victims of their own success. Their innovations had created new possibilities that other societies could exploit more effectively than Venice could defend their established position. But Venice's decline was also accelerated by internal problems that made it difficult for them to adapt quickly to changing competitive conditions. The merchant prince families that had made Venice powerful were now so wealthy and established that they were reluctant to abandon traditional business models that had generated their fortunes. Instead of reinvesting in new technologies and new markets, they were extracting wealth from their existing operations to fund increasingly luxurious lifestyles. Venice's political system, which had been designed to coordinate commercial activities among cooperating merchant families, was proving inadequate for making the difficult decisions required to restructure their economy in response to external competition. The democratic elements of Venetian governance that had enabled rapid decision-making when all merchant families shared common interests became sources of paralysis when different families had conflicting interests about how to respond to new competitive pressures. Some merchant families wanted to invest heavily in developing alternative trade routes and new commercial relationships. Other families preferred to focus on preserving their existing profitable operations for as long as possible. Still, other families wanted to diversify into entirely different activities that might be less vulnerable to international competition. The inability to reach consensus on strategic direction meant that Venice pursued half-hearted efforts in multiple directions, rather than concentrating resources on any particular approach that might have been successful. Meanwhile, Venice's competitive disadvantages were compounding. The Ottoman Empire's expansion had eliminated many of Venice's traditional Eastern trading partners. The discovery of America had created new sources of precious metals that undermined the currency advantages that had made Venetian financial services attractive. Most importantly, the center of European economic activity was shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic as oceanic trade became more important than regional commerce. Venice's location, which had been their greatest strategic asset when Mediterranean trade dominated European commerce, became a liability when global trade routes bypassed the Mediterranean entirely. Cities like Amsterdam, London, and Lisbon had better access to oceanic trade routes. They also had access to emerging manufacturing technologies that could create export goods that competed with traditional Eastern imports. Northern European cities were developing new forms of competitive advantage based on industrial production rather than commercial intermediation. They were creating wealth by adding value to raw materials rather than just capturing profit margins from trading finished goods. Venice tried to adapt by developing their own manufacturing capabilities, but they faced fundamental constraints that limited their ability to compete effectively in industrial production. Their high cost of living, which reflected centuries of commercial prosperity, made it expensive to employ the large numbers of workers required for industrial production. Their traditional guild system, which had worked well for luxury crafts and specialized services, was poorly suited for the standardized production methods that industrial manufacturing required. Most importantly, Venice lacked access to the raw materials and energy sources that were becoming essential for competitive industrial production. They had to import coal, iron, and other industrial inputs, while their Northern European competitors had domestic access to these resources. By 1600, Venice had lost most of their international commercial operations and was transitioning into a regional economy focused on luxury goods, financial services for wealthy individuals, and cultural attractions that drew visitors from across Europe. The transformation was successful enough to maintain prosperity for Venice's reduced population, but it represented a dramatic reduction in their global influence and economic significance. Venice became what we might recognize as an early example of a post-industrial economy, a society that generated wealth through services, culture, and financial management rather than through production or large-scale commerce. The transition revealed both the flexibility and the limitations of commercial societies. Venice's accumulated wealth and expertise enabled them to adapt to changed circumstances in ways that maintained reasonable prosperity for their population. But their adaptation involved abandoning the global influence and economic dominance that had made them historically significant. They remained successful, but they were no longer powerful in ways that shaped international economic conditions. Venice's decline was ultimately caused by their inability to adapt quickly enough to technological and geographic changes that undermined their core competitive advantages. They remained sophisticated and prosperous, but they could no longer maintain the dominance that had made them the center of medieval global commerce. The story of Venice's decline reveals important lessons about the challenges facing any dominant economic power. Competitive advantages that seem insurmountable can be eliminated almost overnight by technological or geographic changes that create new possibilities for competitors. More importantly, the same innovations that create competitive advantages will eventually spread to competitors who may be able to exploit them more effectively than their original creators. Venice's legacy isn't their decline. It's the commercial, financial, and organizational innovations that they pioneered and that continue to shape global economic systems today. The seeds of Venice's decline were planted not in the boardrooms of rival merchants, but in the workshops of Portuguese shipbuilders who were quietly revolutionizing oceanic navigation. While Venetian galleys dominated the Mediterranean with designs that had barely changed since Roman times, Portuguese engineers were developing new ship technologies that could handle the massive swells and unpredictable storms of the Atlantic Ocean. The breakthrough wasn't just bigger ships, it was a complete rethinking of how vessels could be designed, built, and operated for long-distance oceanic voyages that might last months without touching land. Portuguese caravel designs incorporated innovations that made them fundamentally superior to Mediterranean vessels for oceanic exploration. They used lateen rigging that could capture wind from multiple directions, enabling them to sail closer to the wind than traditional square-rigged ships. They incorporated multiple masts that provided redundancy and flexibility for different weather conditions. Most importantly, they were designed with larger cargo holds that could carry supplies for extended voyages, plus substantial quantities of trade goods, making them economically viable for transcontinental commerce. But the real breakthrough was in navigation technology. Portuguese explorers had developed new methods for determining position and direction during extended oceanic voyages that didn't rely on coastal landmarks or familiar star patterns. They were using improved astrolabes, magnetic compasses, and mathematical techniques that enabled them to navigate across open oceans with accuracy that had never been achieved before. More importantly, they were systematically documenting their navigational discoveries, creating charts and sailing directions that could be used by subsequent expeditions. This systematic approach to knowledge accumulation gave Portuguese explorers cumulative advantages that improved with each voyage, whereas Venetian merchants were still relying on traditional Mediterranean navigation techniques that hadn't evolved significantly for centuries. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, he wasn't just finding a new trade route, he was demonstrating that Portuguese maritime technology had evolved to the point where oceanic exploration was becoming routine rather than exceptional. The economic implications of direct oceanic trade routes were far more devastating to Venice than most contemporary observers understood. Venice's entire business model was built on capturing value from geographic bottlenecks that forced Asian goods to travel through Mediterranean intermediaries before reaching European markets. These bottlenecks enabled Venice to impose what were essentially taxes on international commerce while providing limited value-added services. Direct oceanic routes eliminated these bottlenecks entirely. but they also created new economic dynamics that favored different types of competitive advantages. Oceanic trade required larger initial capital investments than Mediterranean commerce, but it offered much higher potential returns for successful expeditions. A single Portuguese voyage to India could generate profits that exceeded the annual revenues of traditional Venetian trading operations. More importantly, oceanic trade favored countries with access to Atlantic coastlines and the industrial capabilities needed to produce goods that Asian markets demanded, rather than countries that specialized in financial intermediation and commercial services. Portugal, Spain, England, and the Netherlands had geographic access to oceanic trade routes that Venice couldn't replicate. But they also had different economic structures that were better suited for the scale and risk characteristics of transcontinental commerce. Northern European countries were developing new forms of business organization that could mobilize larger amounts of capital for longer periods than traditional Venetian partnership structures allowed. The Dutch East India Company, chartered in 1602, represented a fundamental evolution beyond Venetian commercial practices. It combined elements of Venetian financial engineering with new organizational structures that enabled much larger and more sustained commercial operations. The company could raise capital from thousands of investors rather than just wealthy merchant families. It could pursue multi-decade strategies rather than individual trading expeditions. It could integrate military, commercial, and administrative functions in ways that enabled it to establish and defend trading monopolies across vast geographic areas. Most importantly, it was backed by a national government that provided military and diplomatic support for its commercial activities, rather than operating as a purely private enterprise that had to negotiate separately with each foreign power. Venice's response to oceanic competition revealed fundamental limitations in their ability to adapt to changed competitive conditions. The same institutional structures that had enabled Venice's rise, the merchant republic system, the family-based commercial networks, the focus on financial intermediation rather than direct production, became obstacles to effective adaptation when their traditional competitive advantages were eliminated. Venice's political system required consensus among competing merchant families before major strategic decisions could be implemented. This worked well when all families shared common interests in expanding Mediterranean commerce, but it became a source of paralysis when different families had conflicting interests about how to respond to oceanic competition. Some merchant families wanted to invest heavily in developing their own oceanic trading capabilities, potentially abandoning their profitable Mediterranean operations to compete directly with Portuguese and Dutch expeditions. Other families preferred to focus on defending their existing Eastern Mediterranean commerce by negotiating better terms with Ottoman rulers, or developing alternative trade routes through the Black Sea and overland connections to Asian markets. Still, other families wanted to diversify into entirely different activities: manufacturing, banking services for Northern European merchants, or real estate development that could generate profits independent of traditional international commerce. The inability to reach consensus meant that Venice pursued half-hearted efforts in multiple directions, rather than concentrating resources on any particular strategy that might have been successful. But Venice also faced structural disadvantages that would have made successful adaptation difficult, even with better strategic coordination. Their location in the Mediterranean, which had been their greatest asset during the era of overland and regional trade, became a liability during the era of oceanic commerce. Venice was simply too far from Atlantic trade routes to compete effectively with powers that had direct oceanic access. Their high cost structure, which reflected centuries of commercial prosperity, made it difficult for them to compete on price with emerging commercial powers that had lower operating costs and access to cheaper raw materials and labor. Their specialization in luxury goods and high-margin services made them vulnerable to competition from powers that could offer similar products at lower prices, while also providing new products that Venice couldn't match. Venice's decline was accelerated by their deteriorating relationship with the Ottoman Empire, which had become the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean following their conquest of Constantinople. Initially, many Venetian merchants hoped that Ottoman expansion might create new commercial opportunities by establishing a unified political authority over eastern trade routes that had previously been fragmented among multiple competing powers. The Ottomans did indeed create more unified commercial policies across their territories, but those policies were designed to serve Ottoman interests rather than to preserve Venetian commercial privileges. Ottoman rulers understood that Venice's commercial dominance was partly based on preferential trading arrangements that gave Venetian merchants advantages over their own subjects. They began systematically eliminating these preferences and imposing new restrictions that reduced Venice's competitive position. More importantly, the Ottomans began developing their own commercial capabilities that could compete directly with Venetian services. Ottoman merchants, backed by imperial resources and freed from the restrictions that had previously limited their international operations, began establishing their own trading networks that bypassed Venetian intermediaries. The Ottoman Empire also began working actively to encourage non-Venetian European merchants to develop direct trading relationships with Ottoman territories, offering preferential terms to Portuguese, Dutch, and English merchants who could provide competition to Venetian commercial dominance. By 1550, Venice was facing systematic exclusion from many of the eastern markets that had been the foundation of their prosperity for centuries. They were being forced to compete on equal terms with merchants who had lower costs and better political support, rather than operating from the privileged position that had enabled their historical dominance. Perhaps most significantly, Venice was facing early manifestations of what would eventually become the Industrial Revolution. New forms of economic organization based on mechanized production rather than commercial intermediation. Northern European countries were developing manufacturing capabilities that enabled them to produce goods that competed directly with traditional Eastern imports, while offering advantages that imported goods couldn't match. English textile manufacturers were producing woolens that were cheaper and more durable than many Eastern fabrics. Dutch manufacturers were producing consumer goods that combined Eastern design influences with European production techniques. These manufactured goods weren't just import substitutes. They were creating new categories of products that could be exported to Eastern markets, reversing the traditional flow of trade that had made Venice wealthy. Venice attempted to develop their own manufacturing capabilities, but they faced fundamental disadvantages that limited their ability to compete effectively in industrial production. Their guild system, which had worked well for luxury crafts and specialized services, was poorly suited for the standardized production methods that competitive manufacturing required. Their high labor costs made it difficult to compete with manufacturers who had access to cheaper workers. Most importantly, Venice lacked access to the natural resources, particularly coal and iron, that were becoming essential for competitive industrial production. They had to import these materials, while their northern European competitors had domestic access that gave them permanent cost advantages. By 1600, the economic transformation that would eventually be called the Industrial Revolution was already beginning to shift competitive advantages away from commercial intermediation toward industrial production, undermining the foundation of Venice's traditional economic model. Despite their decline as a global commercial power, Venice's innovations continued to influence economic development throughout Europe and eventually the world. The financial instruments that Venice had pioneered, government bonds, joint stock companies, commodity exchanges, international banking networks, became the foundation of modern capitalism as it spread from Italy to Northern Europe and eventually globally. Venice's organizational innovations, professional management, systematic accounting, standardized contracts, and formal legal frameworks for commercial relationships became standard practices that enabled the expansion of international commerce far beyond what any medieval society had achieved. Most importantly, Venice had demonstrated that systematic innovation, applied persistently over long periods, could enable small societies to achieve extraordinary influence and prosperity by developing new capabilities faster than larger competitors could adapt. This lesson would be applied by subsequent commercial powers, the Dutch Republic, the British Empire, and eventually the United States, who used different innovations to achieve similar dominance in their respective eras. Venice's decline was ultimately caused by their inability to continue innovating faster than their competitors could copy their existing innovations, but their legacy was the demonstration that innovation-based competitive advantages could create unprecedented prosperity for societies that were willing to challenge conventional approaches to economic organization. So we've seen how a collection of refugees hiding in a swamp built the most sophisticated financial empire in medieval history, how they transformed geographic disadvantage into economic dominance through pure innovation and strategic thinking, how they invented modern banking, created the first multinational corporations, and developed financial instruments that Wall Street still uses today. But the real story of Venice isn't just about wealth or power. It's about how financial innovation can reshape entire civilizations. Today, when we use credit cards, we're using systems that trace back to Venetian letters of credit. When companies go public, they're using organizational structures that Venice pioneered with their trading companies. When central banks manage international currency flows, they're applying principles that Venetian financiers developed 700 years ago. The modern global economy, with its international banks, commodity exchanges, government bond markets, and multinational corporations, is fundamentally built on innovations that Venice created when the rest of the world was still operating according to feudal principles. Venice proved that in a connected world, controlling the flows of information and capital is more powerful than controlling territory or resources. They demonstrated that financial engineering can create sustainable competitive advantages that last for centuries. Most importantly, Venice showed that small powers can achieve extraordinary influence by innovating faster than larger competitors can adapt. At their peak, Venice was generating more wealth per capita than any society before or since. A city of 180,000 people was controlling 60% of international trade between Europe and Asia. Their merchant families were making decisions that affected economic conditions across 3 continents. They achieved this through patient capital deployment, systematic innovation, and strategic thinking that optimized for decades rather than quarters. But Venice's story is also a cautionary tale about the limits of financial power. The same innovations that made Venice wealthy eventually spread to competitors who could exploit them more effectively. The same networks that connected Venice to global markets also exposed them to global competition. The same financial engineering that generated unprecedented profits also created unprecedented vulnerabilities. Venice's decline reveals something profound about economic power in any era. Competitive advantages are ultimately temporary, no matter how sophisticated or well-defended they appear. The technologies that create dominance eventually become available to competitors. The business models that generate extraordinary returns eventually attract competing capital. The networks that provide exclusive access eventually route around monopolistic control. But Venice's legacy transcends their rise and fall. They created a template for how sophisticated societies can use financial innovation to achieve influence that exceeds their apparent resources. The principles that guided Venice's success, long-term thinking, systematic innovation, network effects, and patient capital deployment, are still creating fortunes and reshaping industries today. Silicon Valley operates according to Venetian principles, using patient capital and network effects to fund innovations that reshape global markets. Modern sovereign wealth funds use Venetian strategies to convert natural resource wealth into diversified financial assets. International banks use Venetian techniques to facilitate global trade and capital flows. Venice's innovations have become so fundamental to modern capitalism that we often forget they had to be invented by someone, somewhere, at some point in history. Understanding Venice helps us understand how financial power actually works, not just in medieval history, but in any era where innovation, capital, and strategic thinking can create competitive advantages. Venice demonstrated that the most valuable asset in a connected world isn't land or resources or even military power. It's the ability to innovate faster than competitors can copy your innovations, to process information more effectively than rivals can react to changing conditions, and to build networks that others depend on but cannot easily replicate. These capabilities enabled a small city-state to dominate global commerce, for over 600 years. They're still enabling companies and countries to achieve disproportionate influence in modern global markets. But Venice also reminds us that no competitive advantage lasts forever. The same forces that enable rapid innovation and economic growth eventually democratize access to the tools and techniques that create competitive advantages. Venice's financial innovations eventually spread throughout Europe and became the foundation of modern capitalism. Silicon Valley's technological innovations are spreading globally and creating new centers of innovation and economic power. Today's dominant companies and countries will eventually face competition from organizations that use their own innovations against them. This doesn't diminish the significance of Venice's achievements. It illustrates the dynamic nature of economic progress. Innovation creates temporary advantages that generate wealth and influence, but the spread of innovation ensures that no single organization or society can maintain permanent dominance. Venice's greatest contribution wasn't just their specific innovations, it was their demonstration that systematic innovation, applied persistently over long periods, can create extraordinary achievements that seemed impossible to previous generations. They proved that small, strategically minded societies can compete successfully against much larger powers by developing new capabilities faster than established powers can adapt their existing advantages. This lesson remains relevant for anyone trying to understand how disruption works in modern markets, how small companies can challenge established corporations, or how emerging economies can compete with developed countries. Venice succeeded because they understood something that most of their contemporaries missed. In a world where information and capital can move freely, the most important competitive advantages are intellectual and organizational, rather than geographic or resource-based. They built their empire on better ideas, more efficient processes, and more sophisticated coordination mechanisms, rather than on superior military force or control over natural resources. These are exactly the kinds of advantages that matter most in modern global markets, where information flows instantly across borders and capital can be deployed anywhere in the world within seconds. Venice's story suggests that the societies and organizations that will dominate future global markets will be those that can innovate most rapidly, adapt most quickly to changing conditions, and build networks that create value for participants while generating sustainable competitive advantages for their creators. Whether we're talking about Venice in 1400, London in 1900, or Silicon Valley in 2000, the principles remain remarkably consistent. Patient capital, systematic innovation, network effects, and long-term strategic thinking create possibilities that seemed impossible to previous generations. Venice reminds us that the future belongs to those who can imagine new ways of organizing economic activity and then execute those visions with the persistence and sophistication required to overcome the inevitable resistance from established interests. The refugees who fled to the Venetian lagoon in 697 CE probably never imagined that their descendants would build the most powerful financial empire in medieval history. But they made decisions about cooperation, innovation, and long-term thinking that created possibilities that even they couldn't envision. In our own era of rapid technological change and global economic transformation, Venice's example suggests that the most important question isn't what advantages we currently possess, but how quickly we can develop new capabilities that will matter in a world that hasn't been invented yet. The future, like medieval Venice, will belong to those who can turn constraints into competitive advantages, who can build wealth from information and relationships rather than just from physical assets, and who can persist through the long process of turning innovative ideas into sustainable economic institutions. That's Venice's ultimate lesson. With the right combination of vision, innovation, and persistence, it's possible to build something extraordinary from almost nothing. If you made it through this entire deep dive into Venice's incredible rise and fall, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how many of you stuck around for the full story. This was easily one of the most complex historical narratives I've ever researched, and what amazed me most wasn't just Venice's wealth, but how they essentially invented modern capitalism from scratch. Like these were people in the year 1000, creating financial instruments that we still use on Wall Street today. The comments section on these historical deep dives always becomes incredible discussion forums, so definitely share your thoughts. Do you think modern tech companies like Apple or Google have achieved the same kind of dominance that Venice had? Are there lessons from Venice's decline that today's dominant powers should be paying attention to? I'm also curious about which part of Venice's story resonated most with you. Was it the early innovation phase, where they were building something completely new, the peak power period where they controlled global trade, or the decline phase, where technological changes made their advantages obsolete? If you're fascinated by how small powers can achieve outsized influence through innovation and strategic thinking, you should definitely check out my video about how Singapore transformed from a colonial trading post into